Okay. My research paper for 500 was originally going to be on students who are bilinguals and if they know a second language, if it makes learning the third language easier. I was always just so fascinated with my students because they graduate trilingual. They can speak Haitian Creole, they can speak English, and then they can also speak French by the time that they graduate from Sunlight Academy. And then as soon as they graduate, they were always so enthralled to learn Spanish. They wanted to learn a new language and they picked it up just like that. So I was so interested in learning more of them growing up, all these different languages, if it helped them learn the fourth language for them really. And I began to research and I found little to no research on the correlation between second and third relationships, so I started to get worried. And then I started to think about, well, what is it that's really stood out to me as we've been studying the book of Brown? And the whole idea and the whole concept of confidence in our students really stuck out to me. And so I started to do just some research on the effect of confidence in our students and how it helps them to learn, how it helps them to practice the new language, how it helps them to acquire the new language and to be able to speak long term and not just for these short, brief moments. So I began to research that topic of the effects of confidence in our students, and I really enjoyed my research and I really enjoyed everything that I've learned. So here we go. I first started out in Brown whenever he is talking about the importance of confidence, and then for my paper I went through and I found this research that showed the importance of confidence and how confidence does relate to how a student scores. And then I started to look up different ways that teachers can help promote and encourage confidence in their students while they're learning. But I really started with this quote from page 154 of Brown, where he says, "Self-esteem is probably the most pervasive aspect of any human behavior. It could easily be claimed that no successful cognitive or effective activity can be carried out with some degree of self-esteem, self-confidence, knowledge of yourself, and self-efficacy. Believe in your own capabilities to successfully perform that activity." I think that's really important for our students to be able to know that they can do a certain activity and then they can then go perform it. They can do it. They know that they can, so they won't try to shy away from their capabilities. So the first article that I found that really touched on the importance of confidence in our learners was they had these 3 different cycles set up. And for each cycle, students were presented 30 words. And after they were presented the 30 words, both in the native language and the target language, they were asked for each word, okay, now your judgment of learning. How would you rate yourself at a 0% or a 100% if you would be able to get that question right, if you had to take a test? And so the students would say, 0% for that one, a 100% for that word. And so they did that once, and then they would take a test after they did their judgment of learning, their JOL, as the research article called it. And then they did again for a second set of 30 words where students had to be exposed to the words, say, okay, now you have to memorize this for a test, and then do their judgment of learning, 0%, 100%, how do you think you would do? And then again for a third cycle. Now, after they did the judgment of learning for each cycle, they then took a test. And for the students who first did their judgment of learning, their judgment of learning was actually kind of high. They said 70% of them said that they would be able to get the answer right, but then their score ended up being a 49%. And so with the low score, the second cycle, their judgment of learning went down significantly. It went from 71% to a 50%. And so after they did the second cycle of the testing, though, their score went up. They were becoming more familiar with the routine and more familiar with the words, and so they performed better on the second cycle. And so after they performed the second cycle, they were going into the third cycle of this, and their third cycle of their judgment of learning went up. It went up to, I think, maybe a 70% because they knew that they had already answered correctly previously, so students knew that they would perform better this time around. And so that was kind of the big premise for this research article, is that if a student knows that he can answer correctly, if he or she has answered correctly previously, he or she has confidence in him or herself to be able to answer correctly again. Another thing is that the research found it interesting that the students were reluctant to give themselves a 100% on their judgment of learning. They found that students felt a little weary to think, oh, I'm going to get every single one right. So they slowed their horses down and they didn't give themselves an adequate rating because they didn't think that they would necessarily be able to do that. And then the researchers wanted to test something else out, and so they did the 3 cycles yet again, but instead of doing a judgment on learning after the exposure to words, they asked the students, if you had to bet, I put in my research paper, it's Las Vegas meets language learning. If you had to bet, if you would get this word right on a test, would you bet? And so if students said, yeah, I would bet, or no, I would not bet on myself for that word, that became the new grading scale, the new judgment of learning for the researchers. And it's interesting because the students ended up performing better and were more willing to bet on themselves than they were with the judgment of learning. And I think it's because it was more relaxed. It was more fun for them to be like, oh, I bet $5 on myself, or I don't think I'll be able to answer that question. I'm not going to bet for myself on that one. So it just makes it a little bit more enjoyable and a little bit more fun. And then the third time around, they really wanted to test the first method of their research. And so they did the 3 cycles yet again with the judgments of learning. But then for the 3rd cycle going through it again, they did 2 different variations. They did a test that was immediate, and they did a test that was delayed to be able to test and see the long-term memory that the students had of what they were learning. And the delayed scores went down, while the judgment of learning for those words, for the one that was delayed, the judgment of learning that the students thought that they would be able to perform was high while their scores were low. But the immediate 3rd cycle, the scores were lower. I mean, the judgment of learning was lower, but their scores were higher. So clearly this method isn't good for long-term memory, but it's good for their confidence to be able to learn how. So throughout all that research, I just really started to see that if a student thought that he or she was going to do well, he or she would do well. And so as educators, what can we do to help promote that confidence in our students? How can we teach them, help them to know, yes, you can do this. You can respond well. You can speak. Just practice. And so there are the obvious that we learn about in our Book of Brown, where we can teach our students in a positive environment. We can constantly give them words of encouragement. We can not overcorrect them constantly whenever they make silly mistakes in their language, whenever they just need to be speaking to get the confidence and to continue practicing. So as educators, we really need to be there. But then I found this one article that was very interesting. This professor with the last name Lee in Taiwan, he taught English as a second language to a junior college. And he started to notice in some of his students, their scores were low. They had failing scores, but in their engineering classes, their scores were high. They were smart kids. They just did not do well in their English classes. And so he started to talk to those students one-on-one. It's like, hey, what's going on? Why aren't you doing well in your English? And they told him, I cannot read in English. I cannot speak in English. I do not have the confidence to write in English. And so he took just 2 students to the side, and I focused on just one. And with this student, he really worked on reading, being able to read with comprehension. And so he would have this student read a story to him and be like, okay, what was that story about? And the student wouldn't be able to tell him or communicate it to him. And so then the professor, Professor Lee, he got out these different photos that basically told the story, but they were in a wrong order. And so he asked him, like, can you put those pictures in an order that will tell the story to me? And so the student was able to put the pictures in all the exact same order. of how the story went, and then he was able to explain the pictures to the teacher about the story. And so then he wanted to work on his writing skills. So Professor Lee said, okay, you can use pictures to be able to explain your ideas, but I want you to put your pictures in the correct order and then write a few sentences explaining the pictures. And so this went well with his writing too, just like it did with his reading comprehension, because he was able to see what he was trying to say and then be able to put words together with what he was trying to communicate to his professor. Now, there was someone who said that the use of pictures is just a supplement. It's not a complete replacement of words, because it's not truly learning the language if they just use pictures, because they're not speaking the language, they're not utilizing it. But it can be a way to supplement students. But his student did comment on how he did have confidence in himself whenever he started to use the pictures. It helped bring those words to his mind of what he could do to say to his professor about what was going on in his mind, and to be able to communicate it in the new language. Something else that I found that was very interesting, which we use here at Sunlight Academy, which made me happy, more so for our younger students than for our older students, is the use of songs. A teacher did this research article about how if you use songs in your classrooms, and if you use songs to teach your student a new language, it will boost up their positive emotions, and it will boost up their positive feelings of themselves, and so they'll feel confident, and they'll remember different words that they hear in a song whenever they're in conversation and think, oh, I've already heard that word, I know that word, I can use that word. And so it'll help promote their confidence later on to be able to use that. So those are just a couple of things that I saw that we can use in our classrooms to help benefit our students. I think confidence really is a big key for our kids. If we can get them to communicate, let them know that, hey, whatever you're saying, just say it, say it, say it. It'll create a safe environment for our students, and they will want to learn, and they will be willing to learn, and they will be ready to practice no matter what it takes. We love our kids. They're the greatest. And yeah, that's all I've got. Sorry I didn't do a PowerPoint. I'm not that fancy with being able to do a voiceover with a PowerPoint, so I figured I would just talk about it. So thank you all. I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas break.